Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm so excited to share with you the kickoff of my autumn seasonal color makeup collection. In this video, we are going to be going through my eyeshadow collection, and this is the first of 3 parts. Without further hesitation, let's get into the autumn eyeshadow collection. For my autumn seasonal color palette makeup, we have a mix of mostly neutral eyeshadows, and these are just things I have in a standalone palette. These don't include things like my Sydney Grace eyeshadows. We are going to be starting off with the Chanel Quad eyeshadow. This is in number 226 Tease Rivoli, and it's just one of the standard Chanel 4 or quad eyeshadows. In here we have more of like a neutral leaning base color taupe with a golden pearl. We have more of a neutral warm bone. We have a little bit more of a slightly rosy, almost like a rosy tan, and then this nice eggplant shade. This almost goes in between 3 different seasonal color palettes. I feel like it could work for a soft muted summer. Something about it feels like it might be a little too intense for soft muted autumn unless you use the deepest shade as very sparingly as a liner. And then I also feel like it could work really well for a deep dark autumn or deep dark winter. This is one I've had for a few years. I remember I purchased this back in 2020 during the pandemic, and one of my girlfriends was working at Nordstrom, and I purchased this and one of the other items we're going to talk about from her. And this was my first Chanel eyeshadow quad, and it's not bad, but it didn't excite me. This is one I want to revisit in the next coming weeks and really kind of gauge how I feel and see if this is something that's worth hanging on to. Up next, I have 2 of these Revlon So Fierce eyeshadow quads. First one we're going to look at is number 961, That's a Dub. And in here, we have another selection of 4 more neutral shades, leaning slightly warm, slightly cool. If you look at the shades here, they are similar to the Chanel. They both have more of a slightly softer sheen or more satin matte all over lid shade. The one in the Revlon is a little bit more of like a golden beige than the mid-tone, where the Chanel has the more rosy. This has a little bit more of a antique gold mid-tone shade, and then you have more of a pink beige reflective highlight, and this leans pretty neutral. It's not overly cool and it's not overly warm. Comparing the 2 deepest shades between the Chanel and the Revlon, the Chanel's deepest shade is going to be more of like a red violet eggplant shade, and the one from Revlon is going to be a little bit more of a blue violet with a little bit more of a gray. It feels slightly more muted, where the Chanel has slightly more oomph in it. Like this feels a little bit more of like a purple, where the Revlon feels a little bit more of like a muted grounding shade. I have no idea if these Revlon So Fierce quads are still around, but again, it's something I want to play with and see if it's worth hanging on to. And the next one I have from Revlon is number 963 Slight Flex. This is one I purchased because Amanda Z talked about this several years ago in one of her eyeshadow videos, and it was this shade down here at the end. She talked about as one of her favorite like lid topper shades. This is really pretty. I've played with it a few times. Being totally transparent, I personally only love one shade from this quad, and it is the lid topper shade at the end. I have a shade similar to this from Sydney Grace called Winter Garden, and I prefer the way that applies. And there's nothing wrong with the shades. The almost like a peacock turquoise shade, it's nice. The all over lid shade, or the shade close to all over lid shade, this just shows up a little, it's a little too of like an antique peach. It's almost like a sun-washed peach shade, and it looks very orange and very disconnected when I try to use this my all over lid shade or my blending shade. And then the copper, it's okay on my skin, where my skin has more of like this cool pink overtone. It does pull a little too red, and it can make my eyes look a little sickly. I think this is going to be one I let go of. I might hang on to it, do a video with it just to kind of share and demonstrate how this works. But after I film said video, if it happens, this will be leaving my collection just because it doesn't excite me. And I have too many autumn color things just hanging out in the drawer because, to be frank, if I'm not creating content with these, I don't really reach for any of these with the exception of one that we will talk about in just a moment. The final of my quad eyeshadows is from the brand rom&nd, and this is a Better Than Eyes eyeshadow quad in M02, and this is Dry Buckwheat. In here we have a really gorgeous color story. The color story, even though it's not one that really flatters me, I really love it just because I love rom&nd's eyeshadows. rom&nd is a Korean beauty brand, Better Than eyeshadow quads. They're really interesting because in the pan they look like nicely pigmented eyeshadows, but when you swatch them on the skin, they almost sink and melt into the skin, and as you blend them out, they almost take on this like satin stocking effect. They just blend and melt into the skin, and they are quite sheer. Even this deeper shade, you can see that it looks quite a bit deeper than my skin tone. I'll also demonstrate with the darkest shade. When you buff and blend them into the skin, they just melt into the skin, and it takes on this really beautiful shaded effect. I don't have any other eyeshadows that really mimic what these do. That being said, they are not full pigment eyeshadows. They are quite thin. If you were someone who loves something like Pat McGrath or Natasha, you like that instant color payoff, something that sticks to the skin when you place it, you might not love rom&nd eyeshadows. A lot of K-beauty formulas tend to be more thin. They're more about enhancing your natural coloring and creating soft, thin veils of color. And that's what I love about K-beauty eyeshadow formulas, especially these rom&nd shadows. Golden top or shade. It has a nice reflect on the skin. It's quite translucent, and it just adds this really beautiful reflect when you pair it over top of one of the mattes. It just creates something really enchanting. So far, of the 4 eyeshadow quads I have, the rom&nd sparks so much joy. I know these shades aren't the most flattering, but I love working with them so much. And these are quite cheap. If I'm not mistaken, I got this on sale on Yes Style, and it was around 10 or 12 Canadian dollars. Really lovely, and I have several of these in other parts of my collection. I really love this formula. Let's touch on the 2 single eyeshadows. These are both from Laura Mercier. One is a full size, one is a smaller, like travel size. These are both old and they are quite dry. I purchased the Laura Mercier Forbidden Rose from the Rose Glow collection, I believe. It was 4 eyeshadow sticks and a highlighter. I decluttered the highlighter a few years ago. But I purchased this around the same time as the Chanel eyeshadow quad, and I don't know if it's just this warm, rusty orange shade. It never really did it for me, and I just didn't love the formula. And these have gotten dry. The Laura Mercier Caviar stick and Strapless, this is more of a golden taupe. It almost straddles that line between a taupe, a beige, and a copper. It's one of those really nice skin adjacent shades that gives a little bit of visual interest to the skin. If you are someone with a slightly more neutral warm skin tone, if you apply this all over the lid and then just blend it out with your finger, it just kind of gives your skin a really beautiful coppery sheen when applied lightly, but you can always build it up and create more of a dimensional look with it. That being said, this is a sample. I've had this since I worked at Nordstrom, and I left Nordstrom in 2019, the end of 2019, and I've had this since, I think I bought this at the same time as the Chanel, so either 2020 or 2021. It just doesn't really do anything for me and the formula is getting dry, I am going to go ahead and part ways with these and just throw them away because they're creams and they're well past their best by date. Also, I painted my nails with a shade that I normally don't wear. This is something that I thought was nice for the autumn vibe of the video, and I've already dinged it apparently. This is one of my favorite more brown shades from Essie. This came out a year or two ago. This is called Crochet Away 691. Really beautiful rosy brown. It's almost like a rosy coffee shade. Really, really beautiful. And this layers well with some of the glitter shades like Feel the Frizzle. Really beautiful. Moving up to some of the larger palettes. This is the Viseart Slim Pro, or is it called Slim Petite Pro? I don't know. VPE01 Neutral Matte palette that I felt like I needed to have for years. And then, if I'm not mistaken, right before I moved to Canada, I purchased it, and then I don't know what happened with it. I must have lost it or something because I don't know where it went. And then I repurchased this after I started my YouTube channel, and I think I got it off Beautylish on sale, or maybe I got it through the Viseart website when they're having like one of their big spring sales. Either way, it's okay. I have not used it a ton since I've bought it, just because a lot of the shades don't work for me. I have kind of swatched it out of order, so I worked my way from here, went down here, went down here, went down, because I wanted to create a gradient of light to dark. This top row, everything pulls a little too peachy warm for me. From this middle row, the only shade I'm really prone to using is the lightest and the deepest shades. The two middle shades, just they pull too warm, and this shade stains my eyelids, and sometimes it can sting a bit. And then I like this bottom row. I've used the gray shade and this more brown shade as a mix together for my eyebrows, and then the black matte is a decent shade. I feel like this could work well for most of your autumns. It could also work well if you focus more so on the bottom row for your deep winters. I'm gonna hang on to it just because I feel like if I part with it, I might miss it. Who knows when I will need it again. And powders are something that are a little bit easier to sanitize. So for me, I'm just gonna hang on to it. And I feel like with all of these eyeshadows, these are gonna work well for most of your autumn seasonal color palettes. I mentioned that the Chanel could do well for deep winter, deep autumn, even maybe soft summer, and that same sentiment carries over more so deep winter, deep autumn for the Revlon. That's a dub. Revlon Slight Flex. I almost feel like this would be really beautiful for a warm, true autumn. This is like a nice blue, air quotes, blue shade for your warm true autumns, because it's more of a warm based blue, meaning it has slightly more blue green than a pure blue pigment. And then the rom&nd, I feel like this could work really well for any of your autumn color palettes. And if you go gently with the darker shade, use it more as a liner, this can also work really well for your spring color palettes. Going back up here, something that really stands out to me with the next palette is the depth and the richness of these three deepest shades. Tartelette in Bloom. I was working at Sephora as an operations manager when this palette originally released, and I remember we received it in gratis. I loved it. It was funny, I loved it so much, I had such fond memories, and I really only used 3 shades from this palette. The shades I mostly used were these 2 softer mattes. So this one is the lightest shade in the top left called Charmer. This one is Flower Child, which is the slightly warmer neutral. It's almost like a peach beige, and then the lightest shimmer shade. Never touched that. So then the next one I would have used is the more matte. It's almost like a beige matte, a little bit deeper than a beige, Jet Setter, and then this more almost like mink taupe is called Rocker. Those were the shades I mostly used, and this is a great palette. I purchased it about 2 years ago, I'm thinking, during a Sephora Beauty Insider sale, and I really love it, and it has a nice like chocolate scent to it when you open the palette. I definitely want to play around with this, create a look with it during the autumn season, and it's really nice. If you like the Tarte eyeshadow formula, which I think is a really nice classic. To me, this is a very luxurious palette, and the Tartelette palettes are, the color selections they include are very beautifully curated. This is a really lovely color palette. I feel like that would work well for any of your autumn seasonal color palettes. If you are a warm true autumn, you might find the 4 shades down here on the end, which are going to be Smoke Show, Activist, Leader, and Rocker. You might find they pull slightly too cool toned, but if you mix them with some of the warmer shades, you shouldn't really have an issue. A little bit of variety and a little bit of contrast from the rest of the color palette won't hurt you. Have fun with it. I think it's a great palette. The original Tartelette is an all matte palette. Then I think there's also Tartelette Toasted, which is even warmer. If you want a perfect warm true autumn palette, check out the Tartelette in Bloom Toasted, which had more of like a red tortoise shell pattern. But the Tartelette in Bloom, really beautiful, suitable for all autumn color palettes. Next, we have the only Pat McGrath eyeshadow palette still in my collection. And when I say still in my collection, I only had this one and one other palette, and I got rid of that shortly after I purchased it because it just didn't wow me. This is the Pat McGrath Labs Mothership 7 Divine Rose. This was one of the very few Pat McGrath eyeshadow color schemes, color stories that really stuck out to me because it looked more neutral cool online. And it's here in an autumn video, so clearly I feel like it leans slightly more neutral warm than when I first saw it. On paper, which is right here, it does look more neutral cool, especially with some of your deeper shades, like the deep brown almost looks plum on paper. These 2 shades pull a little bit more neutral cool, but I don't know. I don't love this eyeshadow palette. The only shades I personally use are the 2 in shades. So you have this opalescent white, which you don't really see the swatch, and then this golden topper, which I will reach in and use this for various looks, especially around holiday season, Christmas, New Year's parties. I will put this topper, just because it's so pretty, on top of other things, just because it gives a really nice flaky gilded effect to the eyelids. With how expensive these are, that makes me feel a little guilty. I want to try to create a video with it, but I don't know. I'm going to hang on to it just because I paid way too much money for it. It still has the plastic protective seal on the front. I don't know. This eyeshadow is not my favorite. I find it really hard to blend, especially with these deeper mattes. I feel like I need to almost buffer my skin with like a translucent powder and then work little by little by little to blend these out, or else they can like stick and get patchy. Meanwhile, I feel like the Tartelette in Bloom, we have some similar shades. I mean, not exact, but there you can create like a similar effect. But these deeper shades, they can be, I feel like they build up a little bit more easily, but they don't have that same formula that causes them to stick. I feel like with even the deeper shades, I can manipulate them and blend them and smoke them out easier than I can this deeper shade. So I'm just not as enchanted with the brand as I wanted to be. Next is a really lovely palette that I really enjoy. I used to own the original version, and then that was something when I first moved to Canada I went through very, very quickly. e.l.f. Mad for Matte Nude Mood palette, and I believe when this first came out, the original iteration was just called Mad for Matte. Then I think they released something a little bit more rosy as time went on, but the front half of this palette is a little bit more neutral. You do have this nice cool pinky shade, and then you have some nice neutral shades. I feel like this is a palette that might pull too neutral cool toned for some of your warm true autumns, but I feel like if you're a soft muted summer, you might have to be a little bit more delicate with your application of the second half of the palette, but you can create a really nice look. I feel like this palette would do exceptionally well for your deep dark autumns and deep dark winters, just because you've got these more muted, slightly smoky feeling shades, but they're easier to build with and easier to play with. And if you have a top coat like either the one from Pat McGrath, or maybe you have something like the Fenty Diamond Dust, you could always pop that on top of this to give it a little bit more of a dimensional effect. But really nice, really great budget-friendly eyeshadow palette if you're looking for something for a deep dark autumn or deep dark winter. Recently, I featured the rom&nd Better Than palette in shade 03 Rosebud Garden. This was my introduction to the rom&nd eyeshadow formula, and to be fair, I find the formula between the Better Than eyes and the Better Than palette to be pretty similar. The Better Than palette, which is the larger assortment of colors, the Better Than palette you get 10 shades, where the Better Than eyes there are only 4. Sometimes in the Better Than palette you will get these large glitter topper shades, which is right here. You can't really see it here. The base is almost like a translucent, almost like a petroleum jelly base with these large glitter particles. They are so beautiful for a one and done shade to take your eyes from day to night. This is a really beautiful rosy palette. There are some shades that feel slightly neutral, some that kind of teeter slightly cool, but for the most part, I feel like it leans neutral warm with a strong rosy base shade, and it's really, really beautiful. If you're someone who likes the idea of a rosy palette like the Urban Decay Naked 3, but you want something slightly warmer, something more affordable, I would say check these out. I think these go for about 25 Canadian dollars, and they're really, really lovely. Also, sometimes K-beauty can be a little bit harder to find in store, and I don't know if it's this way across all parts of Canada, but here in Toronto, we have some stores like Omomo, which they have a really beautiful Dayseek and rom&nd display so you can see and swatch these in person. Also, Scotia Mart. There's one more K-beauty retailer that it's popping up in a lot of the malls that I am drawing a blank on the name, but there's a few places in the greater Toronto, Ontario area that you can find K-beauty formulas to swatch and check out in person. Everything I love about the Better Than eyes eyeshadows remains true for the Better Than palette from rom&nd. Really beautiful, well-curated shades. If I had to get rid of everything we have here, I would be more than happy just to keep my 2 rom&nd palettes and possibly the Tarte. Then again, I just don't reach for this. I think part of the reason I love my Tartelette in Bloom is just from that nostalgia of loving it so much when I worked for Sephora, because me and one of my really good friends, we worked together there, and this was like one of our favorites. It just so many great memories. But do I reach for it a lot now? No. So I don't know. I feel like if I was going to declutter and get rid of things, I would just keep these 2 and I would be more than satisfied, especially with my assortment of like Sydney Grace eyeshadow signals. I was about ready to wrap up eyeshadows, and I realized we have a few more. Etude House Playtone Eyes. I have no idea if this is still around. If it is, it's really nice. This is in the color selection Cashmere Mauve, and it's a nice eyeshadow. I admittedly haven't used it a ton. There was one trip I took this with me on vacation, and I created pretty simple looks. Like you can see, none of my shades are really have a strong dent other than the large base shade, but all the shades are really nice. It's a really nice soft summer, soft autumn color palette. If you are a soft summer, you want to tiptoe into some warmer shades, the Etude Playtone Eyes and Cashmere Mauve is really nice. I do favor this large shade. You can see here on paper, it translates slightly warmer than it does here in the palette, but that's also relative color. It's surrounded by a bunch of warm tones. So on you, if you are someone who has very like cool toned skin, you might feel this pulls a little bit more of like that cool toned mauve, but compared to everything else, just look at home with these warmer shades, just like a warm rosy mauve shade. It's really beautiful. It's simple. I like the formula, but it does not excite me as much as the rom&nd eyeshadow formula. So nice, but if you like the colors, then try it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a nice palette. I just feel like rom&nd and Clio have a superior K-beauty eyeshadow formula. Next, we have Wayne Goss, the Luxury Eye Palette in Pearl. I lusted after this palette so much when it first came out. I remember I was watching Kate Face's review, and I fell in love with this eyeshadow palette and I ordered it that moment. I paused her video, went to Beautylicious website and ordered this. It's nice. That's all. Like it's a really lovely, well formulated palette, and I loved the way this looked on Kate. Kate has red hair and her coloring just looked so beautiful with this eyeshadow color scheme on, and it just really enhanced her. And when I got it, it's pretty, it just doesn't excite me. I would like to create a video with this coming up soon to revisit it, see if I still feel the same way I did, but I don't know. If these are your colors, or if there's a color story from Goss that you really enjoy, I feel like it's a nice eyeshadow formula. This is another one I feel like that would work for most any of your autumn color palettes. If you are a warm true autumn, you might need to use the darkest shade a little bit more sparingly. It does lean slightly cooler than the other shades in the palette, but if you use it as an eyeliner, no big deal. Last but not least is the Natasha Denona Mini Retro eyeshadow palette. This was one of the first mini palettes from Natasha Denona that really excited me. And this is another thing similar to the Chanel and the Goss. When it got here, it didn't spark joy. Even though I was coming from a background of working in makeup for years, I hadn't really tiptoed too much into seasonal color analysis, and I was still struggling with buying eyeshadow colors that people were loving, but I thought because other people love them, I would love them, because I know how to blend and make an eyeshadow work, but I wasn't quite at the stage in understanding colors to understand why I disliked so many eyeshadow palettes, eyeshadow colors. And then this was one of those ones, like these really beautiful, almost like olive or khaki greens. I love them. They're just really not the best suited for my coloring. We'll create a video with this at some point, see what happens, but I just found it a little boring. If you are someone who is in autumn and you want something more everyday with a little bit of color, but color that's not too intense, this is a really lovely palette. And this more like olive green is like quintessential autumn color palettes. So beautiful. Right, and that concludes eyeshadow. I loved going through the autumn color collection, and even though these are not shades that I often reach to for myself, it's something I think is a lot of fun to go through and share with all of you. If you are someone who is new to seasonal color, or you like these more warm, muted shades for your personal makeup style, then I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If you found the information in this video enjoyable and helpful, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more seasonal color and makeup fun. Until we see each other again, I hope you're taking care of yourself wherever it is you are in the world. Bye, y'all.